Okay, here's our second video of section 12.3. In our last video, we talked about range, and then we talked really quickly about standard deviation. We didn't quite calculate standard deviation. What we did in the last example, in the last video, is we just figured out our deviation from the mean. What we're going to do now is we're going to compute the actual standard deviation of a data set. And there are 6 different steps, and you can kind of read the steps below. I don't know about you though, all of that notation is a little bit confusing. So what I do, what helps me, is writing it in my own words so that I can better remember what the 6 steps are. The first step says that we have to find the mean of our data items. So step number 1 is finding the average, the mean. Step number 2 is finding the deviation of each data item from the mean, kind of like we did in the last video. So I'm going to take our data item and I'm going to subtract the mean from it. I'm then going to take each of those numbers and I'm going to square it. I'm then going to take those answers and I'm going to add them together. I'm going to divide by n minus 1, however many items I have, but minus 1. So if there were 5 countries, I'd really divide it by 4. If I had 8 data items, I'd really divide it by 7. I'm going to take that answer then, and then I'm going to square root it. I'm going to find the mean. I'm going to find each deviation. I'm going to square those numbers. I'm going to add those answers together. I'm going to divide by n minus 1, and then I'm going to square root my answer. What that's going to give me is what's called a standard deviation, kind of an average of how far everything differs from the mean. Okay? So we're going to do this example in this video, example number 3, and we're going to take the data items that we had from our last video. Remember the countries and the number of workers? And we're going to find the standard deviation in millions for the 5 different countries. So remember, step number 1 is to find the mean. Well, if you remember from the last video, we already did that. We added up all of the items, the data items, and we divided by however many countries we had. If you remember, the mean was 317. Step number 2, we're going to go through and we're going to find how much each country differs from the mean. Remember, we kind of already did that back up here in example number 2. So I'm just going to take those same values that we got from that last example, and I'm going to transfer them to this chart. So I'm going to take each of those deviations, the 461, the 155, the negative 170, negative 211, and negative 235. Those are my deviations from the mean. That was step number 2. Step number 3, I'm going to square each of those numbers. I'm going to take 461 and square it. Or I could do 461 times 461. I'm going to do the same thing with 155. 155 squared, negative 170. Now be careful. Negative 170 times a negative 170 should give you a positive 28,900. I'd like you to do the same thing for the other 2 numbers. So I've squared each of them. Now my next step is to add all of those together. When I add all of those together, I ended up getting 365,192. Did you? All right. My next step is to go through and divide this number by however many data items I have minus 1. So you remember we had 5 different countries, 5 different data items, but I'm really going to divide by 4. 5 minus 1, or 4. I'm going to take that 365,192, divide it by 4, and then my last step is I'm going to square root that answer. I'm going to do this all in my calculator and not have to enter any decimals because I don't want to round decimals and then later round again. So in your calculator, you should be able to do 365,192 divided by 4, and then you should be able to square root that answer. Some of you might have an answer button. A lot of times it's a second function like below, but you need to square root the answer so that you're not actually inputting in a decimal number and you're only rounding at the very end. Try to do that. Make sure your calculator, you know how to use your calculator correctly. And then let's only round at the very end. And if we're rounding to 2 decimal places at the very end, you should get a standard deviation of 302.16. Make sure you got the same numbers as me. If you have questions, let me know and I'll be happy to help you with your calculator. But please don't round until the very, very end, 302.16.